Not a lot of announcements this week. Um, did get a message from the bishop this week just saying, hey, things have not really changed. Um, in a number of places, the cases of virus are still going up. In a few places, they're going down. But right now, things are stable, so we still follow the document that we already had, which means no real changes. I will be sending out the schedule for worship coming up and the different styles of worship that we will have. Next week is Labor Day, so we'll stick with posted Labor Day, and that way hopefully you all can go have your adventures, just safe and socially distant adventures during Labor Day weekend. So um, hopefully everyone is doing well. I didn't receive any other prayer requests this week, but certainly there's been enough different things going on, from hurricanes to um, more shootings that charged, and we have protests and other violence and violent response to protest. So prayers within that and all of that. Prayers as kids go back to school this week for most of the area schools. This week is the start of school. Teachers have been back already, but prayers as we begin this under this new reality. So that's what's going on. We will be continuing with Matthew this week, and we'll get a little bit of Matthew, and we're going to start mixing in some of the epistles of Paul as we move into September. But for August, we've been sticking with Matthew, so we'll continue to do that. So this is just the continuation of Scripture. It goes into, we're on verse 21 of chapter 16 now. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There's a couple different parts to this, but it's really all about getting out of our own way. That's the idea behind it. And also recognizing the things that are getting in our way as we try to do what we think is right, as we try to do what we think is good, as we hear and respond to the callings around us to do something, to stand up, to act, to be, and be a disciple who is willing to speak up, who's willing to act and live. Do all of those things. What gets in our way? And it's a lot of things, I think. And Jesus in this moment is recognizing that he actually wants to listen to Peter. That's the thing. I think there's a subtext here, right? So it starts out with Jesus is talking about, hey, okay, we finally got to this point, right? Last week it was like, okay, finally, you understand, Peter, you understand well enough that I can feel confident leaving things in your hand because you're going to figure it out. You're going to understand. And because of that, I know that I can leave things to you. And so I'm now comfortable. We can move to the next phase, which is me stepping aside, me moving aside. And just so you know, this is how that's going to happen. It's going to be terrible. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to suffer at the hands of the very people who have been the leaders, because that's the way it has to be. And I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die, and then I'm going to be raised again, so that you know, and that will be your sign that I truly was who you thought I was. Right? Because the passage before was exactly the passage where he asked them, who do you say that I am? Let me see if you've got it figured out. And they've got it figured out, and they say he's the Messiah, and he's like, don't tell anybody, but I'm going to prove it. I'm going to prove it. But in order to do it, it's going to be this. Now we know, fast forward, we know that Jesus didn't really want that. You've heard me say, if you haven't, then hear me say it again, that I think there's no way that was Jesus' hope, was to have the suffering, death, and resurrection. That wasn't the goal. That wasn't the idea. That wasn't the hope. That wasn't the best case. Right? And that wasn't God's best case scenario either. The best case scenario is Jesus shows up, Messiah shows up, and everybody listens. Everybody changes and turns around and just does it. Best case scenario, right? There's no way that wasn't the best case scenario. But because of so many things and so many obvious things, it was clear that wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to work that way. People needed something bigger. And they needed the sacrifice. They needed the resurrection. The disciples needed it. Even as they're able to claim, yes, you are the Messiah, we're able to recognize it. Even with that, they still needed more, which we know again, because we can fast forward. We have the whole story, so we can go forward to that moment of resurrection and know that the disciples, even them, were giving up. Even knowing, being able to claim that he was the Messiah and recognizing it, they still were ready to give up. So they needed the resurrection. They needed it. And he, by this point in the story, has clearly figured that out. But that doesn't mean he wants it. It doesn't mean that's what he would like to have happen. And even the night before, when he's praying, he gives this prayer where he says, let this cup pass from me, which was a saying that existed back then that was, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to go through this. And we hear Jesus praying that, and he says it in the same breath. He says, let this cup pass from me, but if I have to do it, I have to do it, and I'm going to do it. And so it must have been hard for Jesus. Jesus had formed relationships with these disciples, with each of them, and they were his friends. They were like his brothers. Some of them were probably his cousins. But the point is, he had deep relationships with them. He had some good things going. And life was going in an interesting way. And there were some great moments for him, even as there were tough moments and there were awkward moments. And so he had to have cared how it was going to impact his disciples. He knew it was going to be hard for them, just as it was hard for him. And because of that, when Peter, who he trusts, who he just said, you're my rock, then says, hey, Jesus, come over here. Hey, no, stop talking like that. And we're not going to let that happen to you. And Jesus, who knows it needs to happen, is like, hey, it needs to happen. And if you keep saying stuff like that, I don't know if I'll be able to follow the course that I need to. Recognition that Peter is a stumbling block for him, that relationships can be a stumbling block. Even good and healthy and wonderful relationships can be a stumbling block if we let them. Things get in the way. People get in the way. Sometimes that's true even with people who don't mean to be in the way. Act as a stumbling block still can keep us from doing things in ways that maybe they shouldn't. And that's where Peter is in this. And for me, it brings up that question of what are the things that we let get in our way? What are the things that stop us from what we might do? It's not the same as like, am I more cautious than I used to be because I know that I have people relying on me? That's one thing. That makes sense. Is it a stumbling block? Not really. I mean, yes, there are things that I might like to do and I don't because I know there are people relying on me. That's true. But if those things that I feel like I should do, what is it that is preventing me? What is really my concern? Of how willing am I to stand up for what I believe in? The point where I would risk everything? And is my willingness to risk my life, is that me honoring what I'm called to, or is that me being selfish? Is that me not taking care of those who need me? All these things float through our head. I was sent a survey for those who were being asked to be protest chaplains. And I've gone to a few to stand in that place. And the ask was, how much are you willing to do? Are you willing to be arrested? Are you willing to use your body as a shield? Are you willing to walk the margins? Are you willing to man a booth and offer prayer? And that one was really about level of comfort, and it was actually allowing us to do what we felt like we could do. So is that a stumbling block? If I'm not the one who's right away saying, yeah, arrest me, yeah, just put my body on the line, does that mean I'm stumbling over myself and not denying myself? Or does that mean that I'm recognizing what is my course and what makes sense for me to do, because there's always more parts to it. People use this passage as if you choose anything over it, if you fail to prioritize only the right action, the extreme action, then you are not denying yourself. When I think the reality is sometimes jumping in is actually the most selfish act. So it's not about that, right? I want to be clear. I'm not trying to say you got to let everything go and give up everything in order to just go be a social justice warrior and act on behalf of others. That's not the point. I don't think that's Jesus' point. Because like I said, sometimes the throwing yourself out there is actually the more selfish thing. It's always more complicated. The denying of self means living for others. How we choose. For our choices needs to be, how am I living for others instead of myself? Things that we deny ourselves or don't do because of someone else. And the reality is most of the time it's not because they told us or asked us to deny ourselves. It's because we got in our own way. And sometimes if we had just gone ahead, it might have been better for us. Sometimes when we throw ourselves so fully into a relationship that we lose ourselves, we're not actually doing any favors to the person we're in a relationship with, whether that's a family relationship and caring for a parent, or a married partner relationship, or a parent to child relationship, or even just a friendship. To those relationships, and relationships take work, but when we commit to them to the point of losing ourselves, denying ourselves. It's actually a selfish act to throw ourselves so completely into it to lose ourselves, because then we actually about doing our own thing, and that's actually selfish. Being yourself fully and committing to justice, to relationship, to friendship, be both. The act of courage that Jesus is calling us to. Self is not denying who we are, it's denying the selfish things of us. To live a life for others, but not to live a life that gives up who we are. Faith is to find a way to be yourself, as this series in Matthew I think has been building to be yourself, to use your gifts, you to recognize the situation where your gift or some gift that you might have might be needed and necessary, to maybe at times, yes, throw ourselves in the way for others. Not an act of heroism or an act of trying to be recognized, but rather as an act of self-sacrifice that is really about the other. Do we do ourselves be there for others? Yourself and take up your cross. But live for others as yourself. How can I, as my authentic self, is generous, live a life that is giving, live a life that stands for love, not love of self, but love of others, who I am. Otherwise, not who we are created to be. When who that person is doesn't find ways to live for others. It's always easy to figure out where that balance between denial of selfishness and authentic to myself lives. Down to, on the most basic, simple level, is for others being important. Need, not what can I do for others, how do I, as me, as myself, how do I live for others? me, but rather grows by the way I share myself. I've used this word several weeks in a row, this idea of vulnerability, because there's a vulnerability in it. Selfish needs in us. Move throughout this week, throughout your days. Don't deny that. But do what you do and who you do them for. That our lives are here. We are called to servant ministry. How do you, who you are, who God created you to be, to as